the thing I actually saw doing rushed handouts for the Julian Temple film, the Dr. Feelgood film. It's actually on just over the road from here.
This one was taken as well.
Shall I see? Hello, and we're about to start, so if people want to stand, if people want to sit, you can sit. Welcome to the panel on how academics killed rock and roll, more about which in a moment. My name is C.P. Lee. I'm going to chair this debate, which I'm sure will be interesting, educational, informative, etc., etc., and hopefully very humorous. We've got a great panel. I'm going to let the people introduce themselves when they can speak, but essentially Clinton Haley, author, John Robb, author, musician, Lucy O'Brien, academic author, and she will say more, and we have Simon Warner, our glorious leader, I think, in some ways here, or co-conspirator, so good a word. So what I thought would be a good way of doing this would be, I will speak for a few seconds, and then pass it round to each member of the panel to state their case or their views for a few minutes each, then let the debate occur here and then throw it open to the floor. Because it's an interesting question. I'm very, very fortunate because I used to be in a band that I got better. You might say, because I became an academic and that meant that I get a pension. And that's very attractive at my silver years. So I've seen the best of both worlds, and also I've written about music. So that's I think why I'm chairing this one, because I can't make my mind up either way. A few thoughts came to my mind. I remember when Salford University, when it was University College Salford, I think started the first popular music and recording degree anywhere in the world, and it got into the papers as Professor Pop and all this kind of thing, under the auspices of Dr. Sheila Whiteley. And I remember an article in The Guardian, which I think the headline was, paraphrasing Jimi Hendrix, "Excuse me while I adjust my tie." So the idea of universities having a hand in rock music in some way has been, can you teach music? Can you teach rock music? Which was always something anarchic and spontaneous. Perhaps we'll find out a bit more about that. Then the next stage of that began, I think, with the creation of an outfit called IASPM, which was an academic group involved in the study of popular music. Popular music? You can't study popular music. But if we recall, up until 1970, you couldn't study popular culture. It didn't exist. It was something that was underneath your shoe. So then we get the beginning of the study of popular culture. Through that, the different genres and branches and strands of popular culture. Then we get the neo-revisionist attack of the 1990 sympathetic situationist postmodernist faction, who said it's just all culture. So you can't have popular culture or high culture, there's just culture. Which has led us to where we are today, where universities and academics have courses, degree courses, academics write books all about music. And it's about classical music, folk music, pop music, rock music, whatever you want to call it. Has this denigrated the world of popular music? Has it negated it in some way? Has it castrated it? We shall see. My last point before I say anything is that the East German government used to have a panel of academics who would audition rock bands, and then they would say, yes, you are suitable for a grant. And that's the only way you could get equipment or a recording contract. And I'll probably say that's it, because the last time I spoke about that, I got in serious trouble for naming a certain professor as a Stasi officer. So, without further ado, I'm going to let's start with Clinton. Clinton, if you would like to introduce yourself and then state your case.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Clinton Haley. For those don't know any of my stuff, which is truly shocking. Frustratingly, a lot of the time people refer to me as a Dylan author, which for my sins, I am a Dylan author, and a fairly prolific one, but I would like to think I've written about far wider subjects. I've written extensively on punk, on the singer-songwriters, what I consider to be the key singer-songwriters, people like Van Morrison, Bruce Springsteen, Sandy Denny, Richard Thompson. And indeed I have branched out into sort of slightly more wide-ranging books. Orson Welles, believe it or not, Shakespeare's sonnets. I do have a flirtation with academia because, as perhaps very few people know, I almost ended up falling into that river. I did my master's degree at Sussex with the intention of going on to do my PhD, but I saw the light and I got out. And so I've always had, from my own point of view, a sort of a hand's length relationship with academia, even though I consider myself to be an historian. I have 2 degrees in history, and I approach all my work as an historian, I think. I also have serious issues with the way that academia works. And the thing that I would I'm slightly moving the question sideways, what really interests me, and which I think is pertinent to why we're all here this weekend, is really the issue of is the best work, I'm talking about historical work on popular music, being done inside academia or outside academia? I think that's really the key issue at this point, because as I often remind people, a lot of the figures that certainly that I'm writing about are still alive, and certainly a lot of people who knew those people are still alive. And I think it's high time that we kind of got this stuff documented, and that we got the facts right, and that we go out there and try to nail down what really went down while we still can, while we're still dealing in real time. And the theorizing, from my own point of view, can wait. You know, I'm not invalidating having theories that connect Bob Dylan to Live 2 Crew. I don't have an issue with that per se, but I just see it as kind of subsidiary at this point in time. And one of the strange things, because of this kind of weird half-life that I lead, where half the time I have to put my Bob Dylan hat on, and the other half I forget about him altogether, is that Dylan, of course, of all of the figures from the last 50 years in popular song, I would suggest, has become academicized before anybody else. You know, I mean, that transition has already happened. You know, there really are university after university teaching Bob Dylan courses, and people doing PhDs on Bob Dylan, many of whom I met at a Dylan conference in Vienna a couple of years ago, and was shocked to find half a dozen people from the UK who were doing PhDs on Dylan, none of which made any sense to me. I just went, who cares? You know, fans' attitudes to Bob Dylan. Is that really a subject? To me, a subject is finding out what the hell really happened at Newport Folk Festival in '65. That's, you know, as an historian. But you know, the weird thing is that I've ended up going to conferences in Vienna, in Berlin, in Munich in the last 18 months, all on Dylan, and having to put this hat on. And so I see that process happening, you know, and it worries me, to be honest. I think it's too early. I think we're not there yet. You know, academia is about, you know, looking over the entrails of popular culture when it's dead and buried. I don't see it as its purpose to deal with that stuff whilst it's still alive and active and vacant, and you know, and there is a sense of that, you know, that we, you know, if people are comparing you know, spending 3 years of their life comparing the poetry of Bob Dylan and Lord Byron, I think they're kind of missing the point. So that's really the vantage point that I come at it from. I do think it's very interesting that punk, which I grew up with and experienced in real time, is now starting to go down that particular well-travelled road itself. And so it'll be interesting to see how that process takes over something that a movement that was as significant sociologically as it was musicologically. You know, I see that process, I think, will accelerate over the next 10, 20 years. And, hopefully, all those people will go out and read John's book and my book before they formulate their theories about why and how it happened. So I guess those are my thoughts, and feel free to shoot me down in flames.
Okay, thanks very much, Litton. Lucy, would you like to dive in now? Thank you.
Right, well, I've just sort of made a few notes, if I may read. I feel like I'm counsel for the defence here. So, my job, I'm a course leader for music journalism, BA Music Journalism at UCA, at Epsom, and I got into academia through, I've been working as a music journalist since the early 80s, and I've written a number of books, including Shebop, which is a history of women in popular music, and I wasn't really involved in academia until about kind of just over 10 years ago. And I think I was getting very bored with being writing about music and feeling that I was repeating myself to a certain extent, and that the music press, there was no room in the music press, it felt, by the end of the 90s to really explore ideas. I think in the 70s and 80s there was a lot of room to do that and to bring in ideas and bring in theory and really engage with your subject. But in the 90s, magazines like Q, Mojo, etc. Became very much about consumer branding and the star system, and we were discouraged from really exploring ideas. So that's why I ended up in academia, really, because I wanted to go deeper, and found myself teaching the subject that I was passionate about. So just a few points, thinking about why there isn't a conflict between academia and rock and roll. Rather than killing rock and roll, I would argue that academia is creating the conditions for a vibrant music culture in the UK. I feel it's actually ensuring its survival. Pierre Bourdieu defined cultural capital, i.e. the accumulation of specialist knowledge, as the equivalent of economic wealth. It's an investment through education. Rock and roll and knowledge about rock and roll is our cultural capital, both as lovers of music and also as a country that loves music. Bourdieu argued that the main condition needed for cultural capital to be accumulated is time, and I put that in capital letters, T-I-M-E, because what a degree course offers now, the kind of degree course that I'm teaching, is time and the funding to totally immerse oneself in the subject. So my music journalism students, as well as learning about the theory and practice of journalism, they're creating their own music culture on campus. And they're writing for websites like The Quieters, Clash, Art Rocker. They're blogging and they're creating their own webzines. They formed a society, Epsom Does Music, that's involved in promotion and booking bands and organising open mic nights. And many of them are in bands and working as DJs. And I was thinking about that famous quote from Noel Gallagher when he was asked why so many great bands came out of the UK, and he said it was because of the doll. In the 70s, 80s and 90s even, you could sign on and get your rent paid and focus on music. In my case, I left university in the early 80s and I signed on for a year while I was establishing myself as a writer. But now it's almost impossible to do that if you're making your way as a musician, a DJ or a music writer. And I would argue that academia actually provides a space for new writers and artists, and it offers opportunities to create a community, just like the young British artists did with Damien Hirst and Sarah Lucas when they were at Goldsmiths. And I feel that, and I can see that there's a lot of new music writers coming out of courses like the one at Epsom, like at Southampton Solent and Huddersfield. So I can see the students themselves creating their own theoretical and musical community. One of my colleagues, Paula Hearson, has written about this, and she calls it an imagined community, and she talks about the need to create a shared musical discourse with a purpose. I'm going to skip over some of my notes. I think it's interesting that the academics have got the notes. I feel that there are a lot of connections between academia and rock and roll, or if you want, theory and rock and roll. Theory has always been a lively part of music writing, whether it's Simon Reynolds or Jerry Hershey in Nowhere to Run. It's always been there. In fact, the so-called pseudo-intellectual has had an almost shamanistic role in the music press. Writers like Greil Marcus or Ian Penman or Paul Morley. There's always been a really strong link between what I would argue is an academic approach and rock and roll. I don't see it as a duality. I see the two as really connected and combined. And you can see that in conferences like IASPM and also EMP in Seattle and New York, where musicians, journalists and academics get together and explore different issues about music and music culture. So to conclude, in looking at the question, has academia killed rock and roll, maybe we need to redefine what we mean by academia. Is it still a dry, dusty ivory tower that's disconnected from the real world? My experience with today's students is that it's actually the opposite of that. Indeed, I'd argue that academia is now a vital channel for thinking and focused creativity.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Perhaps we have to define what we mean by kill. John?
I throw the chair. Throw the chair. Yeah, so I think the danger with academia and rock and roll, the two are very, very incompatible. I think there's a quicksilver, primal magic of rock and roll that's really hard to define. I think a lot of the dangers of academia is trying to theorise about music and try and explain and make sense of something that often at its very best is completely senseless and has no meaning at all. It's just, you can't, you know, like you write, you see these books, 1,000-page tomes on how and why things happened. And when you're a musician, you know those are not the reasons. They're far more simplistic, far more stupid. And I celebrate the stupidity. I love the dumbness of music. And I think, Lucy, when you're, what Lucy says right about training these journalists up, and I think that's very, very good. But the trouble is when those journalists take control of the whole media, like we have now, the situation we have now, what Barney was talking about in his interview before, which is fantastic if anybody saw Barney's interview earlier this morning, I think it was up early enough. We talk about the greyness of modern kind of, not music writing, but kind of media in a sense, and you don't, the Mavericks have all got excluded, and I think there's a danger, I'm not saying all the students you teach, you beat all the Maverick nature out of them, but when those people tend to get control of the media, they tend to narrow down the focus of what's correct music to like. So they'll be like, this idea, I mean, the Velvet Underground are a great band, and God bless Lou Reed, but the idea that they're the most influential band of all time, to me, it's almost laughable in a sense. Yes, they've got a large influence, but Black Sabbath, well, to me, are far more influential, but they're not a band that fit into the academic discourse, and they get dismissed all the time. But Black Sabbath invented a whole genre of music by mistake, they didn't set out to do it on purpose. But rock music and metal music is probably the largest music in the world these days, but it's not music that ever gets particularly loved or written about or acknowledged in academic kind of circles. And by extension, it's music you never hear in the media at all. It's not like alternative music stations like XFM and Six Music will ever play any metal music. It's looked on as being so stupid that nobody wants to deal with it. And I'm kind of interested in that as well, and I like to blame the academics for that in a sense, because academics like a certain kind of music and a certain very linear, very narrow history of musical culture. Like, you look at the story of punk now has become narrowed down to the story of the Clash. You look at the story of Manchester music, and it's just a story of Hacienda, Factory Records, etc. We're an important part of the whole story, but it's not the whole story. There's other things that went on. Even some like Simply Red, I'm not a fan of Simply Red, but they never get written about. They don't exist. You read a whole thing about Manchester music, you think, where did Mick Hucknall go? I don't like his music very much, but it did exist. And that's one of the dangers, I think. We've got the position now where we have a history music, and everybody teaches us history music and sort of sees history music, and it's becoming more and more narrow, and thinner and more linear. And you know, you talk about, and I talk about people like Black Sabbath, but I can also mention bands like AC/DC, who've got the second best-selling album of all time, which nobody even knows about, who again, massively influential, but they're a band that I don't see any big academic books about them. I don't see them being talked about. You watch a documentary on the BBC about history of rock, and they're not even in there, they're just completely missed out the whole thing. So I'm interested in that idea, and I quite firmly, and in the context of this debate here, I like to blame the academics for this assignment.
Well, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, John.
Yeah, you as well. I'm actually we're outnumbered, aren't we?
I fancy our chances.
Wow, in the blue corner. Simon, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, my name is Simon Warner, and I teach popular music studies at the University of Leeds. I spent the first half of my working life as a journalist, a music journalist. I worked for The Guardian in the early 1990s before entering, the hallowed halls of HE. So I've had experience of both sides of things. But I have to say that I've been completely thrilled by the vibrant excitement of popular music ever since I stood in a record store listening booth with my mother as a 6-year-old, trying to decide whether to go for She Loves You by the Beatles or the Rolling Stones' Not Fade Away. I remember this instance so clearly, and actually opting for the Beatles, and maybe that's been the story of my life. But since then, I've seen Parliament at the Apollo in Harlem, I've seen Elvis Costello at Winterland, I've seen Miles Davis in Joy Division and The Who in this bird city of mine, Manchester. I've watched and listened to the music, raved about it, criticised it, and the pleasure of popular music endures and has endured for decade after decade. But as a rock music journalist who became a rock academic, I have to say that I did eventually tire of that imposing mythology of white rock gods from Presley to Plant, from Morrison to Springsteen. For while those myths of rock and roll have excited me, I reached the point where the truth, if I can use such a word, was something I was more interested in. I remember some decades ago as a football reporter, that for several years, the sheer inanity of finding fresh ways to eulogise that ball in the back of the net moment just became unbearably tedious. Whereas music, for me, popular music, seemed to possess so many more messages to unravel, from class to art, politics, gender, race, youth, history, commerce. All of these interesting layers were tangled up in that world. And that situation, that body of information, drew me to the factual underbelly, often submerged and often ignored in rock and roll. For a start, let's talk about the beginnings of rock and roll. Rock and roll didn't begin because of Elvis Presley. It was this complex and fascinating chain of events from the 1940s into the mid-50s that made his emergence possible. But there is this kind of lasting fable that post-war Anglo-American popular music came along because of Presley. Presley may have been a reason, But if we peel back the layers of that period, there are so many fascinating twists of the plot with which I would not have become familiar if I'd not immersed myself in the academic substance behind the publicity gloss, and particularly to pay suitable credit at this very second to the ideas of an academic called Richard A. Peterson, whose fantastic essay, Why 1955, looked at the advent of rock and roll and showed me new truths and new angles, new inflections on this story. He showed how industrial action among publishers and musicians, the wartime invention of plastic, the emergence of television, for example, to name just a few of the core factors, were more important than Presley himself to the rise of this hybrid music as black blues met white country. So while the pleasures of soul and punk and rap and funk were always in my heart, it was the deeper story that gripped my head. And those deeper stories revealed truths that went beyond quiffs and mop tops, safety pins and wearing the right training shoes. Popular music as a field of study is tangled with the thorns of corrupt business, racial prejudice, artist exploitation and sexual harassment. While the sheer power and emotional force of the sound and the testosterone-fueled tales that support it have an appealing grandeur, it has taken the serious investigation of the many layers of this world to cast some genuine light on a remarkable post-war history. I would argue that academics haven't killed rock and roll. They have helped save it from untruths, its half-truths, its legends, and its fictions. From the publicist spins to the hagiographies of the journalists. While no one assumes that the star system will ever fade away, serious researchers have shown that there is a universe of social and cultural history, race and gender relations, industrial and technological evolution, not to mention global artistic forces, to be explored and revealed. A body of knowledge and understanding that can be a sustaining life force to popular music, past, present and future, and certainly not a death knell. Let intellectual inquiry tease out the facts and expose the lies. Knowledge is strength, and ignorance is no excuse. Thank you very much.